I'm Jenna.
And today we're going to be talking about sentence structure. So before we can get into the more complex things, we have to go back to the basics, as in what a clause is. So remember that a clause is any group of related words that have a subject and a verb. So our first example, John went to the market. John is our subject and went is our verb. So we have a clause there. He ran at the park. We have he and ran for our subject and verb. The dog barked at my neighbor. All of these have a subject and verb, so these are clauses.
All right, now that we know what a clause is, we're going to talk about the different types of clauses. We have independent clauses and dependent clauses. An independent clause can stand alone as a complete sentence. For example, my mom likes to cook and clean. I love to read books. I could say that and stop. They can stand alone, so they are independent clauses. A dependent clause, on the other hand, cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. For example, because my mom likes to cook and clean, although I love to read books, we have that kind of like what's next at the end of that sentence. It can't stand alone. And there are just a bunch of words that may begin a dependent clause. These are called subordinating conjunctions, but you don't have to know that. Just remember, if you see any of these words, it's most likely going to be a dependent clause.
Now that we've talked about the different types of clauses, we're going to talk about different ways to correctly join clauses. So if we look at this example sentence at the top, we have, since I was in a hurry, I forgot my suitcase. Underlined in purple is a dependent clause. We have our subject and our verb, I was, but it starts with one of those words that Jenna told us to look out for. Our clause over here, I forgot my suitcase, is an independent clause. It also has a subject and verb, I forgot, but it can stand alone by itself as a sentence. So this is an example of dependent, comma, independent. When your dependent clause comes first, you put a comma after it before the independent clause comes in the sentence. Other ways that we can join clauses is probably the most basic, independent period. It's just like two complete sentences. We could do independent, semicolon, independent. A semicolon can only be used in between two independent clauses. It is used the same as a period. You'll never have to pick between those two. And just remember, it has to be two independent clauses on either side. We can do an independent, comma, fanboys, independent. So in this structure, keep in mind that the comma has to be after the first independent clause and before the fanboys. And just as a reminder, our fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So if it's any other word, sometimes they'll try to trick you with like then or words like that. Just keep in mind it has to be a fanboys in this spot. And I already talked about dependent, comma, independent like we saw in our example sentence, but if you flip it and your independent clause comes first, then you don't need any punctuation between the two, just independent, dependent, period.
Awesome, okay, so we're gonna go ahead and walk through a sample question together. So here we have, though the group remained polite, but their teamwork was destroyed by the argument. So the key with joining clauses questions is to kind of look at what you have at the front part of your sentence and what you have at the back end. And what I mean by that is we have, though the group remained polite. That's a dependent clause, right? First of all, we have though, and second of all, we're kind of left wondering, okay, like, what's next? That can't really stand alone as a complete sentence, so that's a dependent clause. Their teamwork was destroyed by the argument. That, on the other hand, is an independent clause. That could stand alone. I'm not left wondering, okay, like, what comes next? Because we have a dependent clause and then an independent clause, the correct way to punctuate this would be with just a comma, and that's why it's going to be answer choice D. Answer choice A is acting like it's two independent clauses, which is incorrect because the first one is actually dependent. And B and C are not correct ways to join clauses. B would have to be an independent clause with a comma, and C is not a fanboys. It'd have to be two independent clauses, and it would have to have a comma. So that's why it's going to be answer choice D.
Okay, now we're going to talk about a lot of sentence errors that students make when they're taking their test. So the first two, and arguably the most common mistakes made, are comma splice and run-on sentences. So your comma splice is when you have two independent clauses, such as I went to bed late, I am tired, with a comma in between those. Remember, you cannot put a comma between two independent clauses. You can put a period, you can do a semicolon, you can do a comma fanboys, but just a comma is incorrect, and this will show up a lot on the test, so make sure to avoid that. Second one to avoid is a run-on sentence. This is the same thing when we have two independent clauses, but instead of putting a comma or something incorrect in between them, there's just no punctuation. These are usually a little easier to spot because when you're reading it through Patrick Taft's Watermelons, he buys the one with the best sound, you can kind of hear that it's too much information and there needs to be a pause, because remember, things like commas signify a pause in a sentence if you need to think of it that way.
Exactly. Okay, we're going to run through one more sample question together. This one reads, the computer is probably sick unless the diagnosis may be that the computer has a virus. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. This is a good example and it comes up a lot on the test, is when they try to throw in a word that's not a fanboy to join two independent clauses. So at the beginning of our sentence we have the computer is probably sick, that's an independent clause that can stand alone. And then at the end we have the diagnosis may be that the computer has a virus, also an independent clause, can stand alone. So like Hayden was saying, the only three ways that we can join two independent clauses are a period, a semicolon, and a comma fanboys. The only fanboys present here is and. So for that reason, it has to be answer choice C. So be really careful and make sure that when you're joining two independent clauses, you always use comma fanboys, not comma unless, except, or as if. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about with sentence structure is modifiers. Modifiers are basically just words, phrases, or clauses that add extra information to a part of a sentence. So in other words, they're descriptive phrases and they have to be next to whatever noun they're describing. That's the key. Modifiers have to be next to whatever they're modifying. So for example, Patrick taught math to the tired students on the board. Our modifier here is on the board in purple, and it's modifying math, right? But this placement makes it sound like the students are on the board, which just makes no sense, is incorrect. So, in order to make this correct, we'd have to move our modifier next to math. And it reads, Patrick taught math on the board to the tired students. This is correct because it makes it very clear that the math is on the board, not the students.
So Jenna talked about how you can move modifiers around within a sentence. Some other options that you'll have to do on questions is rearranging the actual independent clause. So keep in mind, the modifier always has to be next to what it's describing, so there's no confusion because it can change the entire meaning of the sentence if it's not next to, in addition to the fact that it's not correct. So if we look at this question, for example, springtime was his favorite season by far, a time of year with longer days and warmer weather. So our modifier is a time of year with longer days and warmer weather, but we don't have the option to move that to the front of the sentence to be next to springtime. We have the independent clause underlined, so what we're going to do is rearrange our independent clause so that springtime is at the end next to its modifier, and the sentence reads, his favorite season by far was springtime, a time of year with longer days and warmer weather, because we know springtime is that time of year with longer days and warmer weather. Modifiers do not only describe nouns, they can also describe verbs, as seen in this example sentence. He talked to his relatives about what had been important to them in the past year. That to his relatives modifies taught.
Okay, so we're going to talk about how to identify different types of modifier questions in a little bit, but first we're going to go ahead and run through two of these sample questions just to kind of get you guys familiar with what a modifier question might look like. And the first is this one. To avoid becoming stranded when winter arrived, the women called a ski plane prudently to airlift them to McMurdo. The best placement for the underlined phrase would be, and then it gives you some options. So, the process we want to follow with this question would be, okay, I'm going to ask myself what action is being done prudently. So we know my modifier is prudently because that's what we're going to be moving. So what is it modifying? What is being done prudently? The women calling the plane, right? So therefore, prudently should be as close to called as possible, and the only answer choice that does that for us is D, before the word called.
Okay, so we just saw one example of a type of modifier question where you're moving the modifier. Now we're going to get back to rearranging the independent clause. So in this one, on the verge of giving up, and then underlined, we have Giesel's story finally hit upon an image that became its basis. So that underlined thing right there is an independent clause. And when we ask, what is the modifier? It's that beginning part, on the verge of giving up. Now, what is that who or what is on the verge of giving up? The answer is Giesel himself. So what we see here is a different starting word kind of in each of these answer choices, which can be a clue that you're looking at a modifier question. To answer choice A, is Giesel's story on the verge of giving up? Probably not. Is an image that Giesel finally hit upon? I don't think the image is giving up. C said Giesel, that's our subject, so he would be giving up, that makes sense. Versus D, the story probably isn't giving up either. That's why answer choice C is our best bet, because it's the only one that has our modifier correctly modifying Giesel.
Okay, so the key with modifier questions is identifying them. Once you can identify that you're looking at a modifier question, then you can follow the processes that Hayden and I just outlined with those sample questions. So the first type of modifier question was the very first one that we just talked about, placement. So in these kind of questions, they'll underline a phrase and ask you where it should be placed in a sentence. You know right off the bat that the underlined portion or the underlined phrase or word is your modifier. So then all you have to do is ask yourself, okay, what is this describing? And place it right next to that word. Okay, so you can see it's asking about placement. We have an underlined modifier. The second type is non-essential, comma, independent clause. So this was the second sample question that we just talked about. These are a little bit more tricky to spot because you don't have a blatant placement question, but they do have a few key characteristics that can help. First off, these questions feature a non-essential and an underlined independent clause or portion of an independent clause. Next, each answer choice will be a rearranged independent clause and kind of place a different noun next to the modifier in each answer choice. So your first step is to identify the modifier, which most likely is going to be your non-essential, then ask yourself what it's describing, and then choose the correct noun from the answer choices. Okay, so our example had that non-essential, portion of an independent clause underlined, and a different noun at the beginning of each answer choice, placing it next to the modifier.
Okay, so the last thing that we have to talk about in this sentence structure PowerPoint is parallelism. And parallelism is basically keeping everything the same. I'll show you what I mean. So like it says, it adds balance and rhythm to the sentence, making it flow more smoothly. Like this first example, he liked running, jumping, and swinging. We have those ing or gerund words for each of the three things in our list, making them the same. It doesn't have to just be like running, jumping, swinging. It can also be he likes to run, to jump, and to swing. We've got that to plus our verb in front of each one of those to make it an infinitive phrase. We can also put just one to at the front. He likes to run, jump, and swing. No one of these is better than the other. You'll use them all differently at different times, but just keep in mind that when you do use them, you do not want to mix forms. In this sentence here, in order for Sam to jump the hurdle, he had to jump quickly, accurately, and in a careful manner. So we're going good with this ly, and then in a careful manner is different from the rest. The ACT wants you to maintain parallelism as best as you can in any opportunity where you see things that need to match up. So we would change that to, in order for Sam to jump the hurdle, he had to jump quickly, accurately, and carefully so that everything matches up.
Okay, so another thing with parallelism is that words are not the only thing that have to have matching form. It can also be phrases. So for example, we have the coach told the players that they should get a lot of sleep, that they should not eat too much, and to do some warm-up exercises before the game. So if you notice here, we have three phrases, right? The first two begin with that they should get, but the second one doesn't match. It begins with to do. So we'd want to change that and have all three begin with that they should get, so it flows and is more smooth. Like Hayden was saying with infinitive phrases, however, you don't always have to write the phrase every single time. I could just have one that they should. So the coach told the players that they should get a lot of sleep, not eat too much, and do some warm-up exercises before the game. Okay. And a nice trick is to write the items after the phrase on top of each other just to make sure that they're in parallel form. You can do this physically or mentally, however works best for you.
So we're going to look at one sample question. So if we look at this one, this one is probably a little trickier because you're reading it through. I know that I could go in there anytime and someone would look up from playing pinball or folding clothes and nods and smiles at me. So at first glance, if you're going really, really fast, you might see the playing pinball or folding clothes and think that you would choose answer choice C to keep with that same form. When you look a little deeper, you'll actually notice that from playing pinball or folding clothes is actually a prepositional phrase. It's not related to the core of the sentence that we're looking at and trying to make parallel. We're actually looking at the verbs in this sentence. So nod and smile need to match the same form as would look up, which is earlier in the sentence, once we take out the prepositional phrase. That's why our correct answer choice is going to be choice B, because it maintains the same form. If we take out that, someone would look up and nod and smile at me. All of those are the same in the same form. Just don't get confused with that prepositional phrase because it doesn't have anything to do with the verbs being parallel.